The message is alarming. It's something that probably people don't think on an everyday basis. As in many other cases, we begin to think only when the untold happens. Let's pray as citizens of this world that those countries who are having nuclear weapons either dismantle them or never to touch the buttons. Ladies and gentlemen, we have had very interesting 5 presentations on different aspects. The common feature, it all talks about geopolitics. The floor is now open for discussions, comments, and any other interventions. Please identify yourself and bring the intervention in. Please bring the microphones down. Professor Rohan.
Hello, Commander Joshua Price, United States Pacific Fleet Plans and Policy Division. Thank you to all the speakers for their thought-provoking presentations. I noticed the lack of multilateral organizations or multilateral vehicles as a way forward in any of the presentations. Does this indicate that the Sri Lankan perspective and/or the nations of the Indian Ocean region consider these multilateral organizations or multilateral vehicles to be ineffective or not feasible for economic and security challenges in the region? Perhaps if Ms. Senaratna could address the economic side and the chair could choose someone to address the security side, please. Thank you so much.
Bhagya, do you want to answer that question? Yeah.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you for the question. It's not that we don't look at multilateral organizations in going forward. I was merely talking about how Sri Lanka can position herself as a country. I'm not disregarding that the multilateral or regional organizations have an equally important role to play. But it's just that we as Sri Lanka or as Sri Lankans need to identify and regulate a policy in going forward. So it was merely looking at the Sri Lankan perspective, but I'm not disregarding the multilateral organizations as you rightly mentioned.
Yes, Rohan.
Rohan Gunaratna. Firstly, the presenters were outstanding. I have questions. One is for Commander Rohan Joseph, and the other is for Admiral Kolombage. Sri Lanka was one of the most prosperous nations, in fact, a model even for Southeast Asia before the Sri Lankan conflict began in the 1980s. In the 1980s, I saw that there was arms, ammunition, explosives, trained terrorists moving across the Pork Straits from India to Sri Lanka. The Navy could not control the situation. If the Navy was much stronger and capable, perhaps the conflict may have not escalated to this point. Of course, the Sri Lankan politicians mismanaged the geopolitics and the geostrategic relationships with India and other countries. Do you think that in the future, if there was a revival, especially with the more recent cases that have been announced, where in Tamil Nadu a number of Tamil tiger cells have been detected and disrupted, do you think that the Navy currently has the capabilities and the strategy to interdict those supplies and travel? This is my first question. Second question is to Columbagay. Sri Lanka Navy played a very decisive role in destroying the Tamil Tiger fleet that provided arms, ammunition, explosives from the Far East. If not for the role of the Sri Lanka Navy, the war would have persisted, would have continued for a long time. Lot more military army personnel would have been killed. You were able very decisively, the Sri Lanka Navy was able very decisively to disrupt that network. So Sri Lanka Navy played a most decisive role. Role of army has been highlighted. Role of Navy not so much. I wish the role of the Navy was also highlighted, because I think that both these elements together with the Air Force played a remarkable role. But I agree with you in your thesis. You mentioned leadership was very decisive. I think you referred, without referring to by name, to Admiral Karanagoda. Of course, we have very brilliant such as Karan Chief, who also played a very important role. But Karanagoda was different. He understood not only the naval dimension, but the political dimension. So I want to ask you, in terms of leadership, what is the investment we are making in the future to produce leaders like that? Thank you.
So thank you very much for that question. I think very rightly it was pointed out by Mr. Ladua Hetty in one of the books that he presented in 2014. He very rightly said there was a proposal sent to late President Jayawardena regarding the requirement of expanding the Navy, but it was disregarded at a certain level by politicians and certain other officials. We paid the price dearly at the end of a couple of years. Now I think the commander of the Navy used to highlight very rightly, he always talks that we don't have a visible enemy now. And he says that it doesn't mean that we are safe and secure. Now we have new challenges. Now these challenges are definitely new to us, because our only challenge before 2009 was LTTE. Now after that we see drug trafficking, human smuggling, marine issues, all these comes into play. So the focus or the vision of the Navy very rightly should be to go towards a policing act, be a constabulary role rather than on offensive lines. We have a huge ocean mass for sure, and with the resources that we have, we cannot say we can't do it. We did the unthinkable with the limited resources that we had when we destroyed LTT. I'm sure with that strategy forming up, we should be able to curtail the illegal activities that are taking place. I'm sure even the US Navy will not be able to place 100% surveillance on their maritime domain, covering each and every square inch. So in that context, the Sri Lanka Navy will definitely work towards strategizing, more towards policing and constabulary role, so that we will be in safe hands in the future. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir, for the question or a series of questions. And I think the first one is the destruction of the LTTE fleet. And I do believe that was attacking the center of gravity of the LTTE. And one very senior officer from the army told me 50% of army casualties came from artillery and mortars. And then destruction of these floating warehouses with hundreds of thousands of artillery and mortars helped the army to maintain their advance and to take the battle back to the LTTE. And the LTTE could not sustain the same level of fighting capability and operating efficiency because they did not simply have the artillery and mortar. So the naval action was a key turning point and perfect attack on the center of gravity of the LTTE. However, as I mentioned to you, any population have this sea blindness. People don't see what is happening at sea. And Navy is generally referred to as the silent service. Not because we cannot make noise, but we are not seen, we are not heard. So that is why I said, as a population, we have to come out of this sea blindness, and I think even Commander Rohan Joseph mentioned and the lady mentioned, we have to see what is beyond the horizon. We are very restricted in our vision. We don't see the potential, we don't see the value of what is beyond the ocean. So we have to create an awareness in the minds of the public, in the minds of our political leadership, the importance of the sea. And I think you mentioned about the leadership. I mean, because I was doing for ethical concerns, I did not mention names, but you are absolutely right. He was a brilliant leader and the right leader at the right time, at the right juncture of the war. And he transformed the entire Navy to be a wonderful fighting mechanism, keeping to the overall strategy of the government. Having said that, the Navy evolved through the 30 years. So he was able to gather, harness all this expertise, all this experience, all the negatives, and make it to a winning Navy. And how do we carry this forward? I think we have a wonderful Navy commander, and incidentally, present Navy commander and myself, we both work with Admiral Karan Nagode in his staff, so we share a lot of common things. And I think that's the way forward, to inculcate these lessons learned from the war we had. It should not happen again. We should not give in to any non-state actor ever again in our life. So we have to record these things, analyze these things, and use the theoretical perspective. And I'm endeavoring, I'm one person who is trying to do that, to record these things, and then so that the new generation of Navy officers will not have to invent the wheel. They can read what we have done and then learn lessons. And very quickly, to answer to the Commander Price question, we do believe in multilateral mechanism. We do believe that no single country can tackle the issues pertaining to the maritime domain alone, even how big you are. And we do play our role in the maritime domain awareness. We do play our role in counter-piracy operations, and we firmly believe bilateral, multilateral, and international mechanisms are the way forward to ensure maritime security for the prosperity of not only our nation, but the whole world. Thank you.
My question is to Ma'am Sinaratne, and I would request respected Admiral to comment on that. You have very rightly mentioned and explained the Chinese maritime Silk Route and the string of pearls theory. But I want to know that there is a very famous naval commentator, Chinese naval commentator, his name is Jiang Ming. He says that in response to the Chinese maritime Silk Route and string of pearls, the Indian think tanks are thinking of another theory which is named as the Iron Curtain. So my question is that how do you see Sri Lanka balancing herself between the Iron Curtain and maritime Silk Route? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. It's a little difficult to explain, but I think, again, Sri Lanka has to think of her national security and how Sri Lanka will, again, be neutral in terms of both parties in going forward. Playing a neutral role is the best sometimes, and like I was saying, to harness the best out of both of these countries, Sri Lanka should play a neutral role in this strategic location, because that is the best way to, again, harness the best out of both countries. Maybe I can have a leisurely chat with you during lunch and take this discussion forward.
Thank you.
Okay, very quickly, if there is a string of pearls, we are the pendant, because we are Sri Lanka in the right location. So that is a coin phrase by some writers, so we will not get into that argument, but we are the pendant because we are in that most important geographical location in the Indian Ocean. And I believe it's geopolitics, and I think Professor Hennayaka is a great lecturer on this. He always talk about three spheres of influence, that is the Chinese sphere, Indian sphere, and the US sphere. And unfortunately or fortunately, in Sri Lanka, all these three circles intersect together. So it has its pluses as well as minuses. So we are not away from the limelight, and we are at the knife edge position. We cannot move here and there without getting hurt. So it's a very tricky situation. And I think we will have to use our virtues. I mean, we have been a non-aligned nation since the inception of our country in 1948. So we have to remain a non-aligned country. We have to be a non-aligned country. But we need friends. And we need friends at the most important times, right? So, I mean, especially if you are taking the post-war situation after 2009, our country was ravaged by destruction. The roads were in a bad shape, so we need the support. But there was a vacuum. Now, who filled that vacuum was China. So, is it wrong for us to go to China at that way? But I'm not saying we should continue that, but we need all the friends in the world to help us, because we had a war. And I think Professor Hennayak and Dr. Rohan Gunaratne mentioned, in the 60s and the 70s, we were much better. Yes, in many aspects, in many social indexes, economy, literature, we were much ahead than the most of the countries in the ASEAN and East. But now, we have lagged behind pretty badly. So we cannot wait another decade or two to come up. We need friends now. So in that way, I think it's an open invitation, because now we have stability, we have political stability, we have highlighted the democracy. So we need friends to come by. I mean, you had been a great friend to us when in need. I think we need friends in need. Thank you.
Thank you, sir and madam.
So good afternoon, sir. My question also goes to Commander Rohan Joseph. So you mentioned in the presentation that Sri Lanka Sea has potential to have oil or petrol in the maritime areas. Then my question is, does this increase the level of security risk, and what are the possible measures are taken or could be taken regarding this concern? And also, what are the maritime strategies can be taken in prevention of security threat to the nation? Thank you, sir.
That is the last question.
Thank you very much for that question. I think in terms of petroleum resources that we have identified in our country, the major risk would be an oil spill. So we need to gear up to face oil spills in a broader context, because we see a lot of ships transiting southern tip of Sri Lanka, over 200 ships, and most of them carry oil. So we need to look into that aspect. The Navy has to develop, obviously, the Coast Guard and other entities, oil spill handling capabilities. If not, that would become a deep horizon incident which took place in Mexican Gulf. And on the maritime security issues, I think, as I mentioned, or rather answered a question from Professor Rohan Gunaratne, we need to go into policing our waters rather than in defensive mode. So that will hopefully help us to retain or detain maritime security issues. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we have come to the last but next item in the agenda, that is summing up by the session chair. Rather than summing up, I will try to highlight some of the issues that we, both you and the audience and us, we all need to think that came out from these presentations. On the first one, Commander Joseph's presentation, what comes out is the need to develop not only, when you say maritime strategy, it has to be a maritime security strategy as well as a maritime geopolitical strategy. Maritime security strategy will really look at the national security of Sri Lanka, whereas the maritime geopolitical strategy will tell us how to live in this modern world, answering the question that gentleman raised there. Okay? So, unfortunately, I have not yet seen, maybe Rohan can eliminate me on this thing, I have not yet seen a government-approved document by Sri Lanka on a maritime strategy or a Sri Lankan security strategy or geopolitical strategy, any of those. Presentations comes and go, and they come and they go. That's the sad story. We don't have a defined state policy on it. On the issue of strategic relevance by Ms. Senaratne, what is important for Sri Lanka also in answering that question is how do we balance between India and China and also US. Don't leave US out all the time. It is very difficult for us to balance because they don't allow us to balance. So the very people who ask the question should ask the question from themselves. Leave the nations as they are. Don't interfere unnecessarily too much into it. Global geopolitics is a story of interference, not non-interference. However, one of the ways, one of the biggest fears that these three nations have, which relate to the last presentation on nuclear, is that somehow or other Sri Lanka will become a place where each of these three nations will use as a place to attack the other, not conventional weapons, but nuclear. Declare Sri Lanka openly, at least to those three nations, if not to anybody else, this is nuclear free. No the weapons, no vessels, has anything to do with nuclear, should be allowed into the Sri Lankan waters. And that should be applied to India, China and the US and to other list of countries that you mentioned as well. Admiral Colombage's presentation brings out a very interesting issue to the rest of the world, including Sri Lanka. Now, why Sri Lanka was able to get at LTTE was because we used the asymmetrical tactics that they were using. Now, the danger is, up to now, generally, that kind of tactics were used only by the terrorist organization. Just imagine a legitimate nation state start to use that on their own for their own geopolitical reasons. Nuclear weapons and aircraft carriers will be of no use. So maybe one of the things that the world need to now think is, more than the nuclear, is how to prevent legitimate nation states using these kinds of warfare to achieve its goals. There's the possibility. 9/11 is a classic example if US wants to know what it means. On Sitara's presentation, the China-Africa relations, here again what is a lesson for the rest of the world, emerging powers, is not to tell the rest of the world what it wants, but tell the world what they want. The success of Chinese strategy in Africa, and to some extent even in China, is not because China demanded things from us, but China gave us what we want. Dominant powers may constantly make this mistake of demanding from the rest of the world what that dominant power wants. It might last in the long run, short run, but not in the long run. On the nuclear, the presentation on the nuclear weapons, the mass destructions, definitions imprison us. The definition on mass destruction is that one weapon destroys a larger number of people. That is one definition of it. But if you look at the actual number of deaths that has occurred in the world, the weapons of mass destructions are not nuclear weapons, but AK-47s and T-56. But we were told that is not weapons of mass destruction. And we were also told not even nuclear. In both cases, there's vested interest why weapons of mass destructions are defined in a certain way. My last point relates to geopolitics. Global geopolitics, in global geopolitics, don't expect logic, neither the rationality. Global geopolitics depends on power or might and influence. Okay? That's true elsewhere in the world. It has always been the case and it will be here today. Second telling about the geopolitics is unpredictability. Okay? We will not know, in spite of all the analytical tools that we will have, what possibly might happen the moment we leave this conference hall. Global geopolitics is that unpredictable. Second thing in geopolitics is that this is a lesson for the more powerful nations, globally or regionally, need to understand no nation, no power is invincible. You might enjoy that illusion of invincibility at this moment, but it's not going to last. Who will replace you, how you will replace, we do not know. The current trends, by predicting along those trends might not give us an answer. The global geopolitics is that very different. However, one of the most important things that we need to understand in the modern world is that the future geopolitics of the world need to be rescued from the trap of national interest and then raise it to the level of global interest. The moment you try to pursue the national interest directly and indirectly under different guises, under the guise of human rights or anything else, okay, is bad for the world. It's amazing. You might say there's a corollary. The human rights is good for the world, but geopoliticizing human rights is bad for the world. What we need to do is to ensure that global interest, that is the problems that the entire world is facing, is to be brought to the forefront and pay attention to that. And the other important point about geopolitics is the world does not belong to any one nation, superpower or regional power or whatever. Similarly, Indian Ocean also does not belong to one nation. Although the name Indian Ocean is the only ocean named after a nation, Indian Ocean doesn't belong to India. It belongs to the world as well. Okay? So therefore, Sri Lanka should be allowed. Therefore, it is very important, relating to the question over there as well, that Sri Lanka should take all actions needed not to allow by one country to use Sri Lanka against the other. To put it into very simple terms, Sri Lanka should not be allowed to be used by China to be used against India, neither it should be allowed to be used by India to use against India, and in both cases against the US. As I have always said, Sri Lankan geopolitics should not be frozen in 2009 May. At that time we had friends, we had enemies, or not so good friends. But 2009 is now 6 years ago. We have moved, and Sri Lanka need to devise a new geopolitical strategy. Look at the world from today's from today's perspective. And that takes us to the very last point. Sri Lanka need not have enemies in this world, because we are not. We are not threatening any other nation state. So therefore what we need to have, what we need to inculcate is friendship with the entire rest of the world. Thank you very much for a wonderful, wonderful presentation. Created a lot of interest in this, and thank you for the Kothanavala Defense University for organizing the conference and having a session on this.
Thank you, sir. That was indeed an immensely interesting session. And now I would like to call upon the session chair to award certificates to the participants of this session. R. Joseph. B. Senaratne, J. Columbage, S. Fernando, and H.E.N. Priyadarshini. Now I would like to call upon Vice Admiral Ravi Vijay Gunawardena, the Commander of the Navy, to present a token of appreciation and certificate to the session chair, Professor Shanta Hinnaikar. Thank you, sir. We now conclude the second session of oral presentation on the sub-theme Geopolitics, Strategy and Professionalism for Development